The Frigatebird. A Nova Scotia Birder Mystery. By Mark Dennis.
Monday, September 2, 2019.
Walking briskly and silently along the trail in semi-darkness, they headed for the spot. The late start had been Martin's idea. King rails were partly crepuscular, he'd said, and the half-light of dusk would offer the best chance of a decent view. The grass was wet from a recent shower and their boots soon got wet too. Not that they were bothered. Birders don't mind a bit of discomfort, and seeing Martin's king rail would be well worth it. Only Martin had it for Nova Scotia, although he had always reckoned that they were commoner than people realized, and that great expanses of suitable rail habitat in the province existed that were never checked. That was how he'd found his yellow rail spot, looking for breeding king and clapper rails. He promised that they could try the yellow rail site another time. Some late song and a few warbler chips had come from the trailside vegetation as they walked, common stuff and not something to bother with. They were after a real prize if they saw it. Martin had a reputation, though. Perhaps this was one of those birds. They reached the pool together. What was the plan now? You lead, I'll follow. That would work. As they edged quietly through the higher marshland vegetation, right to the edge of the pool, the ground was soft, making slurping noises as each foot had to be carefully extracted from the mud's possessive grip. They waited, patiently, scanning with their binocs, heavy mag lights to the ready. There, to the left. It was said in a whisper. There wasn't time to feel any pain. Then time had ceased to exist as he collapsed, face forward into the muddy pool. The slurping noise resumed, the indentations they'd made in the mud quickly filling with softer mud. Soon the rising tide would start to do its job, very efficiently. The grass was still very wet. Their foot trail was not hard to follow in the gathering gloom. The trail was well used by day and would soon dry as the sun rose, but the weather forecaster had said there would be more heavy overnight rain, perfect for further obscuring any sort of trace that might be left in the grass. The parking lot was still empty. Good. He took back the borrowed car. They were supposed to be away for a week and would never know. On foot, he'd soon be able to disappear. Once he'd covered his tracks, he'd be gone. Tuesday, September 3, 2019. Larry and Marge Barnes had packed up most of their stuff. They were heading home to Ontario after their visit to see their son Greg and meet Zelda, his girlfriend. They'd looked at a couple of Nova Scotia properties and had a couple more to visit as they went. Not a walk-around, just to look from the road to see whether they liked the look of the house and the area. Their budget allowed them some scope, but they didn't want to blow everything on a house when the neotropics beckoned annually. They dropped their bags at Greg's place before the three of them climbed into their trusty RAV4. It had never let Lenny and Marge down, but might need updating after they'd moved. "Where shall we go?" asked Greg. "Call me gullible, but I fancy walking that rail trail again." "You know, the one with no rails," said Lenny. Greg agreed that it was as good as anywhere for a couple of hours. Besides, the habitat was good and you never really knew what might be lurking until you'd had a good look. With only three of them on the trail, there was plenty of room, and they all managed to see the few birds that showed. Nothing rare, but nice looks at what was on offer. About 200 meters ahead, the area opened up. Then the open marsh with tidal pools would be visible. There should be a few species there that they might not get elsewhere along the trail, but probably not a rail. Greg stopped and listened. "A chip, over here." Lenny was frustrated. His ears had long ago abandoned the ability of hearing higher-pitched or distant, quiet calls. He'd considered hearing aids, but the cost was high, as was his personal vanity. "I'm not ready for the scrap heap yet," he'd always said, more to himself than to anyone in particular. After a bit of quiet pishing, making a shoo noise to attract the birds, a bright pine warbler hopped into view. "A good bird for here," said Greg. "I'll put the news out. Listeners locally might give it a try." Lenny shrugged. Where they lived in Ontario, pine warbler was a fairly common bird in season. They'd even had them nesting in the yard one year. If they did move, it was going to take quite a while to get used to the different status of common and rare birds in Nova Scotia. Once out into the more open areas, they could see that the tide was good for shorebirds. "And rails," said Lenny, knowing that it would gently wind Greg up. In the distance, a northern harrier was busying itself, head down and focused on any movement. Overhead 3, then 4, then 7 turkey vultures were high on a thermal. Something had clearly attracted them. It didn't take long to find out what. When they got to the small pool, the side of the string rail, what was clearly the body of a man was face down in the mud. From their angle, they could see blood on the side of the head, congealed and visible as a deep red streak. One ear seemed oddly shaped, almost as if someone had taken a star-shaped pastry cutter to it. Otherwise, it appeared to be intact. Greg was shocked and couldn't bear to look at first. It was his first body, but Marge waded straight in. She had been a nurse in real life and knew exactly what to do if the body had an ounce of life left in it. She expertly turned the corpse over and heard the gasp behind her. "Shit," said Greg, who'd found some courage to look. "It's Martin Perry." Lenny took a hold of Greg. "Are you sure? It does look like him, but are you sure?" "Yes, Dad. It's him all right. Muddy and bloody, but I'd know him anywhere." Marge had emerged from the pool, wet to her knees with sludge. "He's dead. Has been for a while, I'd say, at least overnight." Lenny had already started to dial as she spoke. It was a 911. But how would they get down here? There were no accessible paths or anything, apart from the soft, narrow trail. They'd have to either carry the body out on a stretcher or airlift it out. It took about 40 minutes for the two Halifax municipal police officers to arrive. They could see them in the distance as they made their way along the trail. They didn't rush. Once they caught up with the group, tactfully standing well away from the corpse, they started asking questions, checking IDs, wondering what they were all doing down there, that sort of thing. Lenny had dealt with officers like these on more than a few occasions. He was an ex-cop and knew that anything out of the ordinary, well away from their comfort zone, could upset them. This pair looked like they'd never left the city. They were obviously outside their preferred environment. One of them walked to the edge of the marsh. "What makes you think he's dead?" he asked. Marge reintroduced herself and explained that she was a retired nurse and that they were specially trained to spot life and death. This person was dead, unless he could breathe out of another orifice that wasn't his mouth or nose, and he habitually let rats nibble his ears. At this, both officers looked nervous. One even put his hand on his gun. Lenny looked away. He thought he might start laughing at their obvious fear of rats. Lenny suggested that the corpse needed moving, citing the rising tide, but both officers looked horrified. "If we disturb the scene, we could lose vital forensic information," said one of them. Lenny shrugged. "I don't know how high the tide gets just here, but judging by the brown wash on the cattails, I suspect that the water will be over a meter deep at high tide, and that any real forensics have already gone." "How do you know?" "You're a civilian," spat one of the cops. He seemed to have taken against Lenny for some reason. Lenny couldn't resist. "Actually," he said, "we did tides at school, and I'm pretty sure that they rise and fall, peaking every 12 hours or so. The corpse, as we have already established, has been there long enough for rats to nibble, and they would do that at low tide and probably at night. There are northern harriers here by day, and rats are allergic to them. That means that, with the rising tide, a high tide has already visited the body once and a second visit is well on the way. Your choice, guys." The two officers were not at all happy. The one particularly scared of rats kept adjusting his sidearm, making sure he could draw it at the appearance of a rodent. They went and stood to one side, far enough to not be heard, before making a decision. "We need to wait a bit longer," said the small game hunter. After 20 minutes and a deal of mounting frustration on the part of the finders, a third officer arrived on the scene. He was quite comfortable with his surroundings and nodded a hello to Greg. He was a birder, thank God for someone normal, finally. The new guy, who introduced himself as Darren Newell, looked at the stiff. "Is that who I think it is, Greg?" "I think so. I've not been close, though, but it certainly looks like Martin Perry." Lenny chipped in. "For what it's worth, we were here a few days ago on a guided walk, led by Perry, and it does look like him. Different clothes, but, yes, the same man. I'm pretty sure." "Are we sure he's dead?" asked Darren. Lenny let it go, this time. "Yes, he's dead. My wife is an ex-nurse." "Okay, thanks for that." Then, and much to the relief of the city cops, Newell offered to stay with the body and advised them that someone would need to direct forensic traffic down the track, adding that they'd need a four-wheel and they'd need to lift it over the rocks, placed at the head of the trail specifically to stop four-wheel access. So that answered the question of how they would be moving him off-site. The two city boys didn't need any encouragement. They left Newell and strode off swiftly back to the parking lot. The nervous one's hand never left his firearm all the way. Newell used the time well while waiting for the rest of the party to arrive, taking statements, one at a time, and taking care to keep the three members of the Barnes family suitably apart. Not that he suspected them of anything, but it was better not to have their statements influenced by another opinion. When he found out that Lenny was an ex-cop, he asked if he would mind giving his opinion of the crime scene, strictly off the record. Lenny didn't really want to get involved. People, especially cops, can get upset if they think that someone from the big city was muscling in, ex or not. But Darren was quite sincere, and so Lenny said what had occurred to him. Perry was hit from behind with a heavy object. He fell forwards, unconscious. You may find that he drowned, or that the blow may have been fatal. The killer had followed him into the small pool. I presume they were there to try to see the mythical king rail. which means that the killer may also be a birder. The killer made sure that he, or she, followed behind in the same trail Perry had created going in. You can see the flattened vegetation. Forensics should be able to tell if he, or she, put a foot wrong. Newell had been listening intently and writing notes. Lenny waited until he'd caught up and continued. The killer picked the spot well. No CCTV anywhere in the parking lot. Probably the nearest camera is on the road, on that big insurance company building, unless you guys have your own cameras for whatever reason. We used to have them in strategic places. Newell didn't think they had anything like that, but he would check. Thanks for your insight, Lenny. If the lead investigator is approachable, I'll pass on your comments, if that's okay. Be my guest, said Lenny. Wednesday, September 4th, 2019. Sergeant Howie Cross looked at the sheet in front of him. It had a photo of a slightly angry-looking man who was, it said, Martin Perry. Age 35. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall and 170 pounds. He worked as a freelance gardener, cutting grass, lopping trees, that sort of thing, so he was in good condition, physically, apart from being dead. He was single but had a girlfriend, Maura McGowan, who had declined to formally identify the body. Perry lived in Eastern Passage, alone. The house was left to him by his father, no details. His mother lives in BC, she has dementia. He has a brother, Calvin, 35, whereabouts uncertain at present. He'd soon fix that. There was no recent photo of Calvin, but in his pile of papers there was one of the Perry boys on a beach somewhere, aged maybe 10 or 11. Their parents were in the photo. Both boys were certainly fathered by the same man, but then they would be. Cross then read and reread the autopsy report. Martin Perry had not drowned in the mud, but had died from a single blow to the side of the head by an unknown object. Not the usual tool people use for this sort of thing. The implement was smooth, rounded, but not a baseball bat. Nothing found in the immediate vicinity matched the murder weapon, so the murderer had removed the weapon from the scene. Perry's body was undisturbed where it fell except by an animal, probably a rat. A part of his right ear had been chewed. There was nothing else remarkable about the body, except for the tattoo of a bird, an earring, and a pin in his left leg, from a break at some time. Howie rang the number for the lab, asking to speak to Dr. Sarah Brown. I'm reading the autopsy results on Martin Perry and I want to be sure that I understand the tattoo, a bird. Do you know what sort? Sergeant Cross, I'm a pathologist, not an ornithologist, she said, with a trace of annoyance. I'll send you an image of the bird and you can ask someone. There must be a bird watcher in the ranks somewhere. She was probably right. Deciding that now was as good a time as any, Cross opened a new manila file from his stash, marked it up Martin Perry, and started to organize the case material. On his PC screen was a yellow post-it with the name Newell, a phone number, and the words "see email." Newell had been the constable who had called about letting the finders of Perry leave, and he'd taken their statements, very efficient. He noticed that one of the finders of Perry was a retired police officer. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. On the one hand, sometimes ex-cops stuck their nose in, but they could also be helpful. Cross got the impression that Lenny Barnes would be the latter. The email, when he opened it, had a couple of attachments. One was a screenshot of a list of birders from something called the eBird Top 100 for Nova Scotia. After a simple Google search, Cross was soon looking at the Nova Scotia Bird Group homepage. He read the intro and the rest of the public info. The Bird Group people would be as good a place as any to start looking for a killer, thought Cross. His email pinged. One of the admins had already tracked down Calvin Perry via the RCMP database, thanks to his predilection for getting stop violation tickets. He was currently in Rimouski, Quebec. They had a phone number. When he called, he found that it was indeed the Calvin Perry that they wanted. So he broke the bad news. Calvin confirmed that he'd been at home when Martin had died, and he said it would take him a couple of days to get to Nova Scotia. He'd call once he got home, which struck Cross as an odd turn of phrase, considering how long ago he'd left. Why would he still think of Halifax as home? Cross looked at his list and picked a random name. Time to get going.
Who murdered Martin Perry? Get the Frigatebird and find out. A Nova Scotia Birder Mystery. By Mark Dennis. In ebook or paperback. From Amazon.